Well, I talked about the possibility before, but it now looks even more likely that U.S. troops will be leaving South Korea. The status of forces agreement between the U.S. and the Republic of Korea is up this year, and so that means that they've been having to renegotiate a new deal to extend the U.S. Military's stay on South Korean soil. They've had to negotiate some sort of terms of cost sharing because, of course, it costs a lot of money to have U.S. troops stationed all around the world, and while a lot of countries get that for free, South Korea is expected to pay a bit more since they are, pretty wealthy and don't need the charity as much. So they previously, I believe, paid $800 billion a year, and which is more than apparently than most countries would pay for the amount of services that they're receiving, if you can even call it that. Considering that a lot of South Koreans don't like having the Americans there. They think that they're kind of an annoying and a burden and a liability. But nevertheless, there are some people who find value in having the U.S. troops there, and they were even willing to pay more than they've been paying. They were willing to pay up to $1 billion a year to help share the cost. And it looked for a while there that the U.S. was going to agree and that everyone was going to just sort of keep the ball rolling and continue the status quo. That is until old President Trump came in not too long ago, I think it was within the last couple months, and said, nah, $1 billion would be nice, but it would be even better would be $5 billion. But as you may imagine, quintupling the price, it's sort of the 11th hour of the negotiations is not really going to go over all that well with your negotiating partners. And so immediately the Koreans, rejected that and said, well, no, we're not going to accept your offer. And we'll try and negotiate for a different deal, though, and see if we can come to some agreement. So they stayed at the negotiating table. That is until today, in which negotiations finally broke down, and they were unable to come to any sort of agreement. The U.S. apparently stuck to its guns and is still demanding its $5 billion. Now, the U.S. military is not publicly commenting on this, but they're not exactly the most transparent organization in the world. But we can gather enough based on the facts and that we can see with our own eyes, and based on what the South Koreans are saying, to understand that it doesn't look like there will be any sort of agreement by the end of the year. And so that means that on December 31st, the United States military will no longer have any mandate to occupy any land in South Korea. And so that means they're going to have to get out. Now, obviously, the U.S. is not going to withdraw all of its troops within less than a 2-week window, so they're not going to be out by December 31st. I would be, I guess it's possible, but that really is not going to happen. So I'm sure there will be some kind of withdrawal plan if this does continue. Because I guess it's still possible to save the deal at some point, but it doesn't look like anybody's going to budge. The South Koreans aren't going to pay $5 billion. I think that's for damn sure. The people there were outraged when Trump proposed that they pay $5 billion, especially since, like I said, there's a large contingent of South Korean people who don't want the U.S. troops there at all. In fact, what was his name? The Gangnam Style guy, Psy, that was his name. He actually got in a lot of trouble with American fans a few years ago because he said something about how, I was happy on 9/11 or something like that. And, that's a very nasty thing to say, and something that, any person really should be ridiculed for in public for admitting. That is, reflects a certain attitude amongst South Koreans that does exist with regard to the United States and the American people. They see the U.S. as these crappy occupiers who are unwelcome guests in their country. And while the elected government of South Korea has for many years still welcomed the U.S. in, the U.S. also was, for much of their time that they've had troops stationed in South Korea, were the guests of the unelected military dictators. And so there are a lot of enemies of those regimes who associate the United States with that, which of course is not all too unsimilar to the way that people feel in places like Iran or Latin America. There's a lot of pent-up resentment of the United States government. So needless to say, I don't think the Koreans will be clamoring to get U.S. troops back into the country once they're out. I think that once if this status of forces agreement really does expire and the U.S. starts pulling its troops out, I don't think that they'll ever be welcomed back because this is, the Koreans don't really need it anymore. It was arguable whether they really needed it back during the Cold War. Of course, I would say that it was probably in their best interest back then, at least supporters of people who liked, South Korea over North Korea. Perhaps there were people within South Korea who were fans of North Korea. I'm not too familiar with internal Korean politics to say whether there was a large contingent who wanted to be unified under Kim Il-sung or something. But in the last few years, even though North Korea does still exist, it's becoming increasingly unwise of them to keep the U.S. in there because South Korea has been trying to normalize relations with North Korea. They're trying to be a little friendlier. They're trying not to be on such a war footing. They're trying to be friendly with the Chinese, and they have been making a lot of progress trying to cooperate with the Chinese more. Of course, the Chinese have a lot of influence over North Korea. North Korea wouldn't exist without Chinese patronage. North Korea is undoubtedly a satellite state of communist China, much in the same way that, say, a country like Saudi Arabia is a satellite of the United States. These are governments that would not exist without a patron. And even beyond all this, South Korea on its own has one of the largest armies in the world. Of course, North Korea also has a very large army too, I think bigger in terms of manpower, but the South Koreans, I'm sure, are far better trained. And so they don't really need this presence of U.S. troops there to bolster their forces. And of course, if it really did come down to an all-out shooting war with North Korea, I don't think that anything is going to save South Korea. I mean, they would pretty much be annihilated because it's mutually assured destruction still there. There's nukes on both sides. And even if you don't use nukes, the conventional warfare, the conventional missiles and things like that, they could annihilate each other in hours, frankly. Within the first day, millions of people would be dead. Seoul, South Korea, is very close to North Korea, and the North Koreans have all these arms and batteries just stationed along the border, some of which they've been breaking down and taking back inland and disarming, which has been very nice to see. Not a lot of reporting on that though, but there has been some de-escalation at the DMZ. But anyway, the status quo has been over the last 50 years that basically North Korea could destroy Seoul, South Korea, and annihilate most of the South Korean people, kill them in a matter of hours. So paying $5 billion for U.S. troops to remain there, I mean, it's clearly a no-brainer to just say no and to kick them out. Because, the U.S. being there just adds too many variables to these South Koreans and what they're trying to do. It's very clear that, they even have a name for this in South Korea. I believe they're called a sunshine government. And this is a strategy by a government in South Korea to try and open up relations with North Korea, to try and thaw, the Cold War that they still have. And Trump's actions, while you could say that perhaps he was just escalating to de-escalate in these past cases, certainly has gone against the strategy of President Moon in South Korea. It has, Trump has not really been working too well in sync with Moon, at least from the way it looks to us publicly. And so by getting the U.S. out of the picture, it allows the South Koreans to try and forge their own path when it comes to dealing with North Korea and China. It allows them really to have full control over their own foreign policy, and they are no longer going to be, under American suzerainty. And needless to say, anyone who follows this channel would know very well that I think that this is an absolutely tremendous win for the United States, because the less U.S. troops we have in all sorts of tight areas around the world, serving as tripwires that could get the U.S. involved in some major war, the better. I'm very happy if troops came out of South Korea. I'd also be very happy if the troops came out of Germany and Japan. They've been there long enough. If those countries haven't been stabilized by now since the 40s and the 50s, then they're never going to be stable. And obviously Germany and Japan and South Korea are very stable countries. They're doing just fine. They don't need protection from the U.S. anymore. There's no reason why any American soldiers should die for Germany or Japan or South Korea at this point. They can take care of themselves. There was a time before 1945 where countries and nations largely defended themselves. They did not rely so much on patrons. There were different countries that are independent now that were a part of empires, but that's different. We've never had a time in history to where really one country sort of presided over and was the guarantor of the sovereignty of every nation in the world. Most of history has been characterized by a multitude of empires with a multitude of different satellite states. And so it's okay to have more countries that are fully independent and that are not satellite states of the U.S. We don't need to have Germany be our puppet anymore. We don't need to have South Korea be our puppet anymore. We don't need Japan to be our puppet anymore. They can stand on their own, and they should. And so with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.